Hello, my name is Brigitte Lardinois and I am the director of PARC, the Photography and Archive Research Center at LCC UAL. I'm sorry we are a little bit late. We have the inevitable technical trouble getting the event move with everyone in the room, but I want to take a few minutes just to tell you what this event is about and why we have put this together. This is a part of the London College of Communication graduate showcase, and the details of that are going to be shared with you in the chat box. If you have any comments on this or any other event, please share them with us at #LCC2020. Also, I've been asked to tell you that by taking part in this live event, you agree that it's being recorded and that house rules are in place. We expect that all the people who take part in this event will abide by our community guidelines, which are also published in the chat box. Because we have way over we have 220 people in the room at the moment. We have turned all your microphones and cameras off. So if you want to ask a question, which we hope you will want to do, or make a comment, please do so in that chat box. We will then make sure that the panel see your questions. The Decolonizing Lens Part 1 is a first in a series of in-conversations that we, as Photography and Archive Research Center, hope to be presenting over the next year with Mark Seeley, who I am delighted has joined UAL as Principal Fellow Decolonizing Photography. And as part of that, he is also a core member of the Photography and Archive Research Center, which I head up. We have already planned part 2, which we hope will be on the 24th of September. It'll be an in-conversation with Chris Boot and Mark about the recent publication, Decolonizing the Camera, Photography in Racial Time. And details of that will be sent to everyone on the mailing list and on the list of people who signed up today, and of course through our normal channels. Mark and I go back a long way. I first worked with him when I was cultural director of Magnum Photos, and we worked together on an exhibition about modern slavery, which was called Documenting Disposable People, Contemporary Global Slavery. It was at the South Bank and toured widely. And ever since then, we have been in contact. And but now I'm, of course, delighted that I'll be working much more closely with him again. I'm also very, very happy to introduce the other speakers, Professor Gary Younge and Professor Carol Tulloch, and Professor Pratap Rugani, who has agreed to moderate the discussion. I have to thank my colleagues Tommaso, Fabrizio, Ella and Luminata, and of course Oshin Davies, who are working so hard behind the scenes to make this event run as smooth as possible. The idea is that the three presenters, Mark, Carol and Gary, will speak for 7 minutes. At 6 minutes, I will tick a bell, which means that they have to wrap up. And then around 5 o'clock, Pratap will moderate a discussion between the speakers, and after 10 minutes or so, open it to the floor, and we will have then fed the moderators, will have fed the questions that are in the chat box to Pratap, who will summarize in the last 5 minutes of the session. We're still going to try and keep to the time as much as possible. I've said what I needed to say, and I'm going to hand over to Mark, who will introduce himself, and we will stick to the norm, to what was agreed. It's Mark, then Gary, then Carol, and Pratap will take over. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Brigitte, and just very quickly, it's just an honour to be invited into the UAL kind of community as such, and to try and think about how we share ideas about moving forward, and really, I suppose, some of the journeys that we've been on kind of photographically to think about the work that images do in culture. I think actually I wanted to start with that really, because I guess that's kind of like my mantra. It's like, what's the work that images do in culture, and how do we kind of like read them? And I guess part of the work that from the very origins of autograph, if you like, on the journey into autograph, is the whole question of how race and rights and representation kind of come into the frame. I mean, I feel as though it's been a very, very long journey, and one that's obviously reaped benefits in terms of some of the successes that we've had, but I also think we've got an incredible long way to go. And I also think that's an opportunity as well, not necessarily just thinking about things within the pessimistic side. I wanted to share really the idea of how time works within change as well in terms of photography and understanding. And I think one of the best people to look at that is through the lens of, say, someone like Rotimi Fani-Coyote's work. I mean, Rotimi was very active in the early 80s and you know, passes away 89. And his work really has taken a very long time for people to finally get to understand the significance of it. I mean, here we have a practitioner that was, you know, coming out of, you know, Nigeria, is queer, is living in London, is kind of a disappointment to his parents, is very much seen as an outsider. And he's working with the camera to try and articulate his kind of contemporary life and his condition. He's living with somebody called Alex Hurst, the writer, and the pair of them are in dialogue about what kind of difference they can make to people's understanding of their lives and their desires and the place that they want to be in society. Next slide, please. I think it's really important when we look at the kind of trajectory of, actually, can you go back and just go back to Rotimi's work, please? Didn't realize we'd gone there. Really important that we look at the kind of trajectory that people like Rotimi have, because I think when his work arrived on the scene, and this is part of the kind of decolonizing kind of work, is that nobody really understood it. Really, people could only look at Rotimi's work through the lens of what they'd seen before, if you like, through the canon as such. So Rotimi, for the frustration of his work, was always being compared to somebody, say, like Robert Mapplethorpe. And that's because the black body was seen in a way that only the kind of, I would say, the traditional Eurocentric lens had framed it within. Whereas someone like Rotimi was trying to break that mold fundamentally. And it took somebody like, say, Cobden and Mercer and others to begin to write about the work, to publish about the work before the work could be thoroughly understood, and then finally filtered down into the institutions which now are actively trying to collect the work, which is, of course, fantastic. Because they recognize the kind of, I suppose, the delinking work that Rotimi was doing with the camera, the delinking in terms of what we understand before. He was bringing in totally different cultural readings and influences into the work. His Yoruba life and his Yoruba kind of existence had created a kind of, if you like, cosmology of understanding for him that he could begin to bring to his practice. And of course, if we didn't have access to that kind of cosmology of understanding around his work, then it meant that we, unless we did new work ourselves, were shut out of understanding what he was trying to do. Because of all of our points of reference around what he was delivering in terms of making were not there for us to see. So I think it's really important when we think about decolonizing the camera or decolonizing kind of knowledge or different kind of epistemes, is that we offer ourselves up, if you like, into a kind of, rather than universal knowledges, that we enter into what Walter Manola and others are calling the kind of pluriversal space, where all these different knowledges around indigenous cultures and other ways of being are brought into the table, and they help us, if you like, build a much wider knowledge pool of how we read kind of cultural differences or different signs within, I suppose, our practices. Next slide, please. And it's also interesting how, if we think about the work that images do in culture, that people like Faisal Abduallah kind of also migrate to different understandings within themselves. I mean, in many ways, I think, you know, building a golden barber's chair for somebody like Faisal Abduallah becomes a kind of story about the work, that how we see ourselves, not necessarily about through photography, but in this sense, thinking that the barber's chair is a place of kind of a very special location for the Black subject to sit within, because it's one of the few spaces within culture that they can walk within, sit and be cared for in a particular way, that it's a transformative space. And I really enjoyed working with Faisal Abduallah on the building of this chair, if you like, because that in many ways feels as though that's part of the work that we've got to do, especially when we begin to recognize the question of race within the history of photography. I think that there's got to be some form or some degree of transformation happening all the time, if you like, to turn back the tide of that big and long historical arc of representational fields that, of course, photography has had from its very inception. So I think what's interesting about the kind of contemporary condition and what contemporary artists are doing, like people like Faisal Abduallah, next slide, please, are using the camera and using the kind of 3D and the sculptural elements to build this representational field that offers up the possibility of different locations and different transformative possibilities. And as I say, it's an ongoing process, one that works, if you like, next slide, please, one that works in a way that builds in different histories, that allows different experiences to come to the fore, that are not separated or segregated, and bringing in kind of different cultural reference, like in this case, the Tupi Conqueror, very similar as a cultural figure in Yoruba culture as well, but also in Jamaican culture. This is a figure who will actually spoil your day if you are seen as a kind of bad person or someone who hasn't actually resolved their past. And I think bringing in these kind of, as I say, cosmologies or different kind of spiritual elements into the making of a contemporary culture allows us to break, if you like, the contemporary field of vision, allows the camera to become an imaginative space rather than this place that simply keeps on locking people down into a kind of indexical kind of cartography that actually categorizes people in a space and place which they've got no making within themselves. And I think this is the arc of change that I think we're about to see occur, if we're lucky. I think this is the arc of change I think most and a lot of contemporary artists coming outside of the Western tradition of photography are bringing to the table. Next slide, please. And back into Rotimi Fani-Kooli. It's a place where, you know, the imagination and desire come into the fore. And those desires are not simply locked out of some kind of pedagogic space, they're inserted into that space so that they help us begin to understand how we see, how we read, and what we do with the potential knowledge of, say, like the Yoruba cosmology in a sense, how it's connected in many ways to the kind of different types of thinking that are out there, but are locked out of the canon, and also presents a possible place where we can do what I think is the most important part, new learning kind of like trajectories. Next slide, please. So it's not surprising that, you know, the radical elements of giving birth from a kind of male body or thinking how desire works on the kind of male body through Rotimi's works offers up a real challenge, because in many ways, I think it's asking us to do a lot more work than we're used to. And I think that's where, I think that's the kind of the gambit, if you like, the challenge that we like, especially when we begin to think about the new narratives that can be written, from what perspectives, and who gets to tell the story, and who importantly is in the frame, and how is important within the opportunity that the decolonizing kind of theoretical baseline offers us to work within. Thank you. I'm not sure who's speaking next, because of where we are.
I hope it's going to be Gary. Can I get confirmation that that is indeed the case? And thank you, Mark, very much for that presentation. I know that there was a problem linking our universities. Is Gary able to speak?
Go ahead, Gary.
So, hi. I am probably a disembodied voice in this line. I want to talk to you a little bit about storytelling and the colonial lens, and to do that through the story of George Duckson. If you look at the first slide, please. George Duckson is Gabonese, 22 years old, Gabonese man, whose father fought for the French during the First World War, and who fought for the French during the Second World War. Here he is, he's called the Lion of the 17th Arrondissement. Here he is helping to capture an American tank, German tank in 44, somewhere around Paris. And in subsequent pictures, we see him with what looks like a broken or a sprained arm. Now, when it came to de Gaulle and the liberation, and de Gaulle marching down the Champs-Élysées, both the British and the Americans said, you know, we know that 2/3 of your troops are African, of the Free French troops. But we see the one by Leclerc is, they're white guys, and we want them, for reasons of quote-unquote French morale, the optics would not be good for you to march down the Champs-Élysées with those people. Now, there are documents to show that both the Americans and the Brits agreed with this, and so they tell de Gaulle, get your white guys together, send the black guys home. I don't know this for sure, because it's only been about 6 months since I found out about George Duckson, and I'm still trying to find out a lot more. It looks to me like George doesn't get the memo. And so what you see, and this is on the day of the liberation, next slide, please, is a series of what looks like George photobombing de Gaulle. We see him, sorry, next slide. Hello? We see him just over de Gaulle's shoulder there. As de Gaulle puts down the reef, you can just see him, his arm is in a bandage. Then you see him to the right there over de Gaulle's left shoulder. Now, clearly, someone, here he is again, to the side, next slide, please. Someone has told him, you're not supposed to be, next slide, you're not supposed to be on this march. And so the remaining pictures, and there are some videos of this too, you see him being escorted off the march, escorted off the parade. Next slide, and the slide after that, being forced off. And in a sense, when and now the final slide, please. He makes it all the way down, pretty much the end of the Champs-Élysées, although they get much rougher with him as time goes on. And this says a few things to me as a kind of as a journalist and as a professional storyteller, and as someone who's constantly trying to engage, particularly a British consciousness, because that's where I live, about its colonial past and how it informs us. If we spend a moment with George Duckson and his story, then we learn a few things, don't we? We learn a few things about the history of the Second World War. We learn quite a lot about, or we have it's a portal to learning quite a lot about the African contribution to the Second World War, both among the French, but also among the British, and the black contribution, if we also include America. We understand that whatever the Second World War was about, it wasn't about democracy. There's Stalin, there's de Gaulle, there's Churchill, there's Roosevelt, all in different ways, either openly suppressing all votes or openly suppressing the votes of black people. It really doesn't matter. If a group of people can't vote, then you're not living in a democratic system. It starts to explain why every time there is a movie about the Second World War, there will be someone saying, well, either why aren't there black people in there? Or if they put them in, what are those black people doing in there? And that it suggests the way in which we are, the way in which our history has been amputated. And the kind of, there is the real and the metaphor of Duckson being pushed out of line, being pushed out of the story, which is when I think of a decolonizing lens, and when I think of kind of what it is to be the son of Barbadian immigrants in this country and to try and tell stories. And to think, I saw something somewhere saying recently about head teachers, and it said if you can't see it, you can't be it. Now, I don't think that is entirely right. I think that if you can't see yourself in it, would be better. Not just to see your likeness, but to see yourself in it. And I would look at the various accounts of British history and just think, what has this got to do with me? Where am I in this? I said I'm doing a documentary for the BBC about the impact of Black Lives Matter on museum collections, and I was saying to a curator, I don't feel, I never went into museums and thought they were hostile places. I was just deeply ambivalent. I thought they had nothing to do with me. Nobody had, none of my teachers or the museums had really made the connection between what they were doing and
Gary,
myself. And so,
you have 1 minute,
this
Gary.
is just a problem for me. It's a problem for Britain that we are all, by looking through a colonized lens, amputating ourselves from the broader history. I had to turn the sound down in order to be able to, so I didn't hear myself think. So, fearing that I may be over time, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was wonderful. And can we connect to Carol?
Yes, by phone. So I can't see my images, but don't worry. Okay, hello everyone. I'm just gonna do my thing. So can I have the first slide? Is it up? I hope. So for me, talking about the lens is not just only about the photography, but about our eyes, what informs what we see, which kind of follows on a bit with what Gary was just saying. So my research is centered on difference, and the starting point for me are the styled black bodies of the African diaspora, and what I call style narrative. How we style ourselves is part of who we are, is about self-telling and an aspect of autobiography. And of course, it's about agency. And then everything that black people wear in places where they are not seen as equal, seen as fundamentally different, is incorporated into the concept of blackness, of being black, or of difference. The magic is now as being how we have taken that context and reframed it as a materialization of reason, as a right to be, to belong, and as an aesthetic of presence, which I talk about extensively in the book, The Birth of Cool. But recently I've been thinking, but is it always the case that style body helps in this way? So often the skin tone, and that's the best phrase I can come up with at the moment, puts into the shade the relevance of the clothes of the wearer. And I'm thinking about the small gestures of everyday racism and small gestures of anti-racism that can have a big impact. I'm going to just make reference to a personal experience, and I'm thinking about the women, about when a woman who does not have my skin shade, on seeing me, clamps her hand over the opening of her handbag and moves it from one side of her body, the side that's nearer to me, further away. This has happened a number of times before the pandemic, but happened last week on a day of leave to celebrate my wedding anniversary. My husband, who is white, was walking behind me. I don't think she saw him. What exactly did this woman see when she saw me? What had been fed to her that led to that act? Every time it happens to me, and the West Bay experience was a solo trip to Vista Village last year, the seemingly small gesture of a woman clamping a hand on her handbag, moving it away from me, chips away at my right to just be in the public space. So in my monograph, Versus Cool, I just mentioned, I talked about the importance of a handbag in relation to this photograph of my mother, and that she chose to have taken in Birmingham in the 1950s. That it can be a sign of adventure for a black woman, someone who travelled over from Jamaica on her own. But for some, the automatic gesture of holding it close on seeing a black woman nearby is a sign of fear of attack, of protection of the contents of the handbag. That is, by extension, personal protection. And as Adam Phillips says, it's in the gap between the life she has and what she wants that a woman chooses a bag. I really want to talk about, I'm talking about this one object and what it means for one woman and what it means for another, and how it's used as a kind of racist attack. What is interesting with the bag incident happen, I no longer see the owner, but it's the memory of the determined act, moving the bag that is out of my reach. This connects for me. Can I have the next slide? This connects for me with the fundamental significance of the small everyday gestures of being, something that has emerged for me while working on my current curatorial project with the photographer Roy Mehta, and his re-engagement with a series of photographs he took between 1989 and 1993 of Black and Irish people in Halston, Wilson, London, near where he grew up. During our conversation, Roy has said, "This is a disjunct. You see the world out of your own head. People don't see you as you see yourself. They see you as other. It is the anxiety, concern of seeing that other reflected back that has been the reasoning for Roy part of the reason for Roy taking photographs at that period of the late 80s and early 90s. And this interest in everydayness I'm exploring with Roy's photos, I've considered previously through the larger gesture of anti-racism in the form of the Rock Against Racism movement during 1976 and 81. Sorry, can I have the next slide? Against the grand gesture of fascism and the National Front. In this article, Style Activism, the Everyday Activist Wardrobe of the Black Panther Party and Rock Against Racism movement in Fashion and Politics. Style activism is the embodied making of a political activist's self as statement, whether lifelong or just one event. I argue here that in reference to the concept of style activism, the style body is a sincere identifier of the individual within an activist movement. Next slide, please. I first talked about style activism in the preface to the book that Mark Seeley and I edited, Sid Shelton, Rock Against Racism, back in 2015. It was through working with Sid's photographs that I realised that Shelton's images prompt us to remember that individuals at raw carnival gigs, demonstrations were the events, they were raw. So then I had to focus in on the individuals and who they are and what they were and so forth. So the choice of garments or supposedly ordinary components from an individual's wardrobe, to style themselves to take part in an activist event, takes on a potent message, what Sid often refers to as a graphic argument. So for me at the moment, this idea of everydayness, of habit, repetition, supposedly mundane, is primary to being. and these sort of issues are impacting on racism and the way that we respond to racism, I suppose. So I'm mixing up the idea of personal experience and then through photography. That's it for me. Hello?
Thank you very much. Pratab, over to you.
Hello. It's really fantastic to hear those distilled presentations, and you know, my thanks to three colleagues of our honorary doctor at UAL, Gary Younge, and our first principal fellow in Decolonizing Arts at the University at the Photography and Archive Research Centre, and of course our own Professor Carol Tulloch. It's so important that we're able to start joining the dots between these conversations, and I'd just like to draw out a couple of themes and put it to the three panelists first. We'll do this for about 7-8 minutes and then come to broader questions. I have to say, I don't know if you can see me, I'm not able to see any of our panelists at the moment, but Mark, if you're able to switch your camera on, Gary and Carol, please do interrupt and cue me, because I won't be able to see when you're ready to speak. But just picking up from those fantastic presentations, Mark signals this ideal even, of a pluriversal space, and talks about being locked out of the canon. And now that the three of us and three of you panelists and many others in the room have some responsibility, if you like, for the recreation of a canon. So we might want to look at how we re-narrate these stories. I'm thinking, Gary, thank you so much for that. You coming back to this image of an amputation, the amputating of people's ideas, cultures from history. What's the restoration? What's the process of restoration that lives there? And then Carol, with your style agitation, I think one of the really refreshing reflections of this is that, unlike a generation ago, the last really significant, I suppose, anti-racist moment for the culture more broadly, we have a whole generation, or a bigger generation, I should say, of cultural activists, artists, photographers, fantastic writers, and so on, in institutions who are able now to, exert their influence on how to do this better. So I guess first kind of question is, if there's one thing that you would like to do to move us towards a more decolonized perspective, what would that be? And I can't actually see, so whoever wants to speak, please. Mark, is that you going?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Are you picking that up? Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I keep on coming back to words like amplify. I mean, I think, colleagues at Autograph have been talking about how do we not necessarily shout, but kind of amplify things. I'm often thinking about how sound works. I think, sonic presences and allowing those stories to kind of enter the enter the frame, the stuff outside of the frame. I mean, I think I'm also fascinated with what happened at World War II and all the kind of liberatory kind of like moments that really were disappointed. And I think that is a kind of key point, literally not allowing Black people to walk down the Champs-Elysees, literally hours before that they were in a part of a liberating force. And the height of which that came from colonels and generals, that it was like, we desperately want these people to go back to where, we imagine that they come from, all those like constructed places. So I think really the idea is that, if we can begin with a kind of honest conversation, which says, who did what, where, and when, and why, and all the kind of complexities of that, all of what the empire and all of what the fighting fascism, the face of fighting fascism really looked like. I mean, even if we wind back into someone like Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech, the end of that speech, which nobody actually listened to, says, but if we fail, we will have our colonies to be secure within. It's a really interesting place that we know we have this other empire or these other people that we can rely on. We have a navy and we have the colonies that will come to our rescue. The new world will continue to fight for us. Well, I think in many ways the new world did its work. you know, and we're like saying, well, we did the work here, folks, you know what I mean? Frontline stuff. And now if we can just, you know, carry on doing that work within the institutions of education and the workplace in generally, and break those kind of, if you like, break down those kind of, you know, systems that kind of keep those stories behind. And yet the evidence is so there, right? The photographs are there, you know, the images are there. And it's just like, if we just can if we can just have the generosity to allow those images to be reread, to become part of the story, to stop missing those chapters out, because the book is not complete kind of socially, politically, and culturally, because those chapters are there. You just got to just insert them and make them really rich. And I think that's part of the work that we've been trying to do at Autograph for a very long time, successfully in some instances and not successfully. It's like, just stop segregating these kind of like narratives and allow those voices to be amplified. I think that'd be such a good piece of work to do.
Thanks, Mark. And I'll come to Gary or Carol in a moment. But just to say, in addition to looking at what's there, and there's fantastic photographs of George Duckson, I'm also reminded of, for example, film history. So when we look at the great films of the liberation of Paris, for example, something like Is Paris Burning?, the Black and North African and other troops were absolutely not there, and already written out over whitened what we were then to inherit as a European history. So part of our struggle, if you like, a little bit like the debate about the Colson statue in Bristol, that went up during, you know, the height of imperial imagination of Britain as the new Rome, you know, centuries after Colson. So there's a kind of high watermark that we of imperial history that created these statues, and now we're having an argument with the telling of history, not just the events that happened. But Gary or Carol, I don't know how your sound connection is, but can either of you come in here?
Yeah.
I've got back in here, both of you. Can I take Gary first?
Okay, sorry, Carol. So I kind of I agree with Mark to a point where he said we have, you know, the story's there and we have to insert them. But the thing is that when you insert them, it changes the other stories, right? That if the story of the Second World War is about making the world free for democracy, then what do you do with George Duckson and the fact that you know, he was shoved off the march in a way, and he was actually shot not long after for pilfering, I think, for selling on ration goods. You know, what do you do with the fact that the Americans who were sent to denazify Germany were in Nuremberg, both grilling Germans about their role in the Second World War as Nazis, and operating colour bars and grilling African Americans about breaking colour bars, you know, in Nuremberg that didn't really exist for black people until the Americans got there. So that kind of they break open when we decolonize. It is about kind of the excavation of stories that have been buried, the retelling of stories that have been mistold and so on, but it also, they're relational. So then it does change the other stories. You know, the story of the joyful Paris in 1944 becomes very different when you understand who was instrumental in the liberation and who was left out of the liberation walk and so on. And so it is that kind of, there is that churn, they affect everything else. And there is one other thing that I would say, which is that, and Britain is particularly good at this, is the kind of the distinction between the individual and the collective history. So British people will say, we have not been invaded since 1066. So go back that far. We won the war, even if they didn't fight. We won the World Cup, even if they didn't play. But they'll never say we colonised people, or we raped people, or we stole stuff. And so there is this constant effort to claim what is great and to kind of divorce yourself from all the mess. And I think one of the things these stories do when they are shoved back in there is kind of give us an opportunity to kind of understand how we got here and kind of and who we are.
Thank you, Gary. And is that part of the challenge, I suppose, not just for, you know, culturally in the ways you're describing, but for each of us individually, as we revisit, for example, the most, you know, popular hero in the 20th century for British people, when you measure that by different ways, Churchill, and now we're revisiting aspects of his biography, but then facing that really delicate and beautiful and difficult, painful moment of how do we hold the heroism and the mess, the light and the shade. So that's I want to bring in Carol here, not necessarily on that point, but Carol, what are your thoughts? Style agitation speaks to this, I think.
I mean, I'm only just adding on to what Mark and Gary said, and that thing of carrying on and, you know, disrupting or and through the revisiting and the exhibition of stories. And I would love autographs. Promotion of missing chapters, and I think when Gary was talking, I'd completely forgotten that I have a copy of it, of Picture Post, and it was a celebration with, and I use that term consciously with in quote marks, of women coming from the Caribbean that were to join the army, I think. I haven't seen it for a long time, but the women became almost, you know, almost like they were on the front page of Picture Post. But it was about their journey coming over and then joining the forces here and joining the war effort. But I can't think of it, of that aspect being covered anywhere else. It might, somebody can correct me, but I'm not sure that's something that's being looked at in great detail. But if I've got that wrong, but it's just this moment again, this example of missing chapters, really.
Thank you. I'm just going to weave in a couple of comments that are coming in from our questions. There's one lovely one here. If I don't name the person, it's often because these comments are anonymous. So a couple of anonymous comments, but this one's picking up from Mark's curation. Your approach to curation takes its cues from jazz saxophonist John Coltrane, which I love. What can we learn by taking the same approach to decolonizing the canon or our institutions?
Wow.
Sounds like fun.
That's a nice question. Yeah, thanks. I mean, I increasingly what I like about John Coltrane, for example, is that each time I go to visit John Coltrane as a musician, there's another story within the story. There's another place of kind of learning within the music that he produces. There's another narrative at the end. It kind of almost as if it's, you know, there's a bass line and there's a rhythm and there's a place of being, which is a kind of shared kind of idea of a kind of, you know, spirituality through the music he's trying to take you on. And it goes off in these incredible, wonderful tangents. But you also come back somewhere. You know, there's not a strict beginning, middle, and end. And I quite like that as a kind of metaphor, because you know, when you're in a different mood, a different place, a different state of anxiety, or a different place of happiness, or whatever, you're learning things differently all the time. But I like the idea that there's a baseline which you kind of like start from somewhere, but at the same time you can go on a journey to somewhere else. But also importantly, John's generosity as a kind of, you know, band leader in that space that allowed his kind of participants, allowed his kind of, you know, his fellow band members to literally fulfill their ambitions with their instruments as well. And I think that's the kind of decolonizing place I'd like to be in. It's like, let's share that thing and allow it to and allow the kind of rhythm of knowledge, if you like, not to be so structured, and not to be so repeated, and not to be so burnt into us that it can't change and become much more, what's the word, experimental and avant-garde, and create new meanings in that space.
Thank you. Carol or Gary?
The same sort of thing.
Go ahead, Carol.
Are we going on the same thing to do with music?
If you want, or take it where you want to.
It's interesting because Mark's into John Coltrane, I'm into Archie Shepp, so it's the abstraction of Archie and the long instrumental. I can't say the word, but and also it's his experimentation that's always drawn me to Archie Shepp. So that I'm borrowing from that, I suppose. I think, I think that's the only thing I can really say about that. I think with me, with curating, for me it's always about the object and then placing those objects and the kind of empathy that might be, or the tension that might happen between those objects. And again, for me, I can go from jazz and then I can go to Public Enemy, and I can't believe that Archie Shepp and Public Enemy and Chuck D did a jazz album together. So that was perfect, really.
Yeah.
Symphony. But that's it, really. That's all I can say.
That's great. I mean, we're partly. I mean, we're in this very particular context at the moment, and I guess the demonstrations that we've seen, over the last sort of 7-8 weeks, 9 weeks or so, one of the things that's really struck many people has been a different kind of rhythm of agitation, you might say. So these demonstrations appear to be much more multiracial, younger, and with a broader agenda, if you like, which has been embraced by many arts organisations and universities much more quickly than some anti-racist work in earlier years. Gary, is there anything that makes you think that other kinds of narratives are possible now that maybe we haven't been able to create a broader audience or a broader politics around?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in the last couple of months is significant constituency for kind of reimagining who we are and what we might be. I mean, I was struck when Mark was talking about Coltrane and that way in which you go back and you get something else that's never finished. And I often think when you hear the more conservative types say, well, where will this all end? And they say it about everything. They say it about gay marriage. What next? Dogs, people marrying dogs marrying each other, or you bring down Colston statues. Well, what next? It's like we don't know what's next. We don't know. That's what's amazing about these moments. That's what, in some ways, makes it a revolutionary moment. But that it's an ongoing process which hopefully never ends, of kind of re-examination and self-examination. And so this window was opened up, and I don't think there's an infrastructure. I don't think we have the infrastructure, the anti-racist infrastructure, to kind of sustain the message. So we have to kind of hope that it pollinates in different places and finds a home that people can then take on in their own way. Because now there was a lot of mocking of the way that the institutions kind of rushed to declare themselves in favour of Black Lives Matter and all of that. But the thing is that they've said it now, and having said it, we can hold we can hold their feet to the fire. My fear is that we're going to end up with a lot of anti-racist, racial awareness training and stuff like that, and not enough actual root and branch structural change about where money goes and how it's spent and all of that. But the opportunity has been created, and the moment is pregnant, really.
Yeah, and I mean, very well said, especially this week of all weeks when John Lewis is you know, the great civil rights activist, is I think, correct me, Gary, with your experience, but is he the first black person to be lying in state in the US Capitol? No one's been honoured in that way before. First legislator. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. First legislator. Yeah. I'm seeing a few questions, comments in the chat. One of which I'm going to suggest that Brigitte takes up when we round up, which is requests for more information, teaching materials. For anyone connected with the University of the Arts London, we also have the Decolonising Narratives reading group, and I know Rahul Patel's here, and I think others, and they're listing some things in the chat box, so that would be useful. I wanted to take us to a kind of sensitive area of this conversation, which is the dangers of decolonising, as well as the beauties and opportunities. And I was reminded, Gary, I really don't want to embarrass you, but I feel I do need to say this. When you won the James Cameron Award at City University, and there was a phrase there in the citation that said, "You, in your writing, combines a moral vision and professional integrity," which I think is absolutely right, and I was delighted to be there at the time. And when I was revisiting some of your work, I'm looking at your book, Who Are We, from 2010, and I just want to read one sentence from that, because I think it throws down a challenge which I'd like us to take up and then see how that resonates with people in the room. So this is the end of Gary's book, and Gary says, "When the Gentile condemns anti-Semitism, the white challenges racism, or the citizen takes on xenophobia, they lift the sense of siege on the other, creating possibilities for the Jew, black or foreigner to denounce the dupe and the demagogue in their own community." So the moment that we speak up about, in this case, racism, obviously any protected characteristic, is also the moment where we need to step up to the plate and make sure that we don't repeat or rehearse some of those group projections, stereotypes, even the hatreds underpinning them. And one of the questions speaks to that, saying, again, an anonymous one, how do we get to the arc of change without allowing it to become too stereotypical? That's quite broad what I've said, but any takers on any of that?
I mean, I think that kind of that there's no answer to that. When we get there, we'll know, you know, and that kind of, if it's effective, I don't care if it's stereotypical or not, really. I mean, it might not work as art, but so long as it works as change. So I kind of, I feel I've just written a forward to Native Son. There's a new edition coming out, and James Baldwin famously, he called it everybody's protest novel, and he said it was, you know, trying to fit life neatly into pegs, which I thought was pretty unfair. But I would also say that kind of there are books like that, say The Jungle by I've got a blank on his name there. But The Jungle is a good example about kind of meatpacking in Chicago. But the fact is that that book actually changed the laws about food, and that will do, you know, frankly. So there are some people who want a good change, non-stereotypical change, very, you know, or whatever it is. So long as the change comes, honestly, so long as it's positive and progressive change, I don't think we get to be too picky about.
Right, and it's a messy process. We're nearly at time. I'm just going to read you a fragment of another question and see if Carol or Mark want to pick that up, which continues this theme. And here's the question. The assumption behind Decolonizing the Lens, so reference to Mark's book, is that the mind of the person behind the lens is by default decolonized. That's not always the case. It's a constant battle to pick and unpick years of lived social and ideological conditioning through decades of colonialism. What's that process like? Well, I think you'll have worked with many artists, makers. We're all in different ways makers, aren't we, in this room? How do we work with that inner process?
I think, am I on here? Yeah. I mean, I think it is. I think that's the key, isn't it? I think it's doing the work, isn't it? I think you have to just open yourself up to being capable of just trying to. I think it's also really allowing yourself to take the risk as well. There's something about working and doing things that we have to have the capacity to make mistakes within. We have to be able to push through and do things that are uncomfortable and not necessarily. It's like being in the lab. We have to be able to be creative. I think that creative. You know, so much of creative. So many. I think I'll say this as more of a provocation than anything else. So many kind of like creative things around, you know, race or place are almost like prescriptive. It's like, this is where it wants to go. But what happens if we don't know where that's going to go? Because that for me is part of the inquiry. And I think, you know, we have to be able to make as many bad things as we make good things to assess what the good things possibly are. And I think that's, and also sometimes when we're making something in the process, it might not work in the time we're in, but it might work in the future. It might have actually do something that we don't understand in the present.
That's right. And your curation of Rotami's work really feels that it's getting more resonance. I'm seeing more questions and asked requests for references. So I can't resist the great Stuart Hall and Mark's book here called Different. And that offers all sorts of imaginings there. Carol, did you want to come in?
No, I keep agreeing with Mark and it's that thing of doing the work and just getting on and doing it. And you know, I started doing the research that I did because when I went to libraries, there was nothing there about Black at the time in the 1980s. There was not many books around Black history, Black photography. There was so little things, but particularly because dress, I was a fashion student. That was my interest. So that's when I started doing the work. And as Mark says, we don't know where it's going to go. You just keep trying. You know, I was traipsing through archives with days, and you just think, what am I doing? Where am I going? There'd be images that were so upsetting, but then it starts to come together, and then you can't believe that other people want to read it, or it has an impact, or then you start doing exhibitions. But you choose the format that you want to use to get the information out there, the thing that, as they say, makes your heart beat, and then just do it. Just do the work. But do it, as I said, you know, without it becoming, what was that question? The arc of change, but without it being stereotypical. You know, just think, explore, kind of be more exploratory as well, I suppose.
But Carol as well, and Gary, I just wanted to say that one of the things that the space for investigation, the space for inquiry, which is why I think the university or the research grants, and you know, this is one of the things I'm very concerned with. It's like I'm not always going to agree with people who want to work through the lens of kind of, you know, inquiries into race, but what I want to do is want to make sure or try and encourage, you know, the research possibilities for people to do that work. Because so much of what gets done, I mean, I'm speaking through the lens of autography, it gets done on a lens of, you know, deliverables that are out there, which kind of repress the research work. And I think that this is where the, you know, having Black professors in spaces, being able to have those research opportunities, you know, really can change the field. I mean, Gary will know that the time to write is really important. Just the time to write.
Oh God, yeah. I completely.
So.
I mean, I was just going to say something as well. That again, building on what Mark just said, it's something that Corbina Mercer said at the lecture at Chelsea as part of train, and the first thing he said was, research takes time. And it was one of those, it was like a light, we were all doing it, but it was a light bulb came on, to remind us that research takes time, and that thing of the space for investigation and the funding and all of that, and have the headspace to write.
Got it. And I mean, Carol, you and Sonia Boyce as two of only 25 black women professors in the whole of the UK. It's really worth just acknowledging that how much you have done in order to create that space, to dare to imagine, which others can start seeing that imaginal reflection of a future that maybe they wouldn't necessarily be able to think of without it. So thank you for that. We're pretty much at time, so I'm just going to round up and hand over to Brigitte. But while I just say a couple of closing remarks, I'm going to ask all three of our panelists to say in 10 or 15 seconds, one of the, Gary talked about root and branch changes at universities, and the focus is very much on the arts and universities and how are we to do what we now say we aspire to do. How do we do that better? How do we deliver that? So I'm going to come to you in a moment for that. And just to say, we've decided to run the full hour, so we're nearly up to that point. And apologies for those of you who had to wait a few minutes before we entered the room. There are many, many questions in the box, which we're not going to be able to come to at this point, but there are resources which we can help signpost you to. And also just to really encourage you, if you're new to UAL or this environment, do feel free to keep up the connection and see how we can continue this conversation. From the questions I'm seeing, we've got a whole series of conversations to go deeper into. So thank you for everyone who's attended. And then just a quick fire round from the three of you. Who's ready to go first? Root and branch changes. If you could do one thing, if you were our chair and vice chancellor now, what would it be? Carol. Gary, go on. It was your phrase, root and branch. And Gary, you've gone to full-time university work, I think, now. So, well, it's fresh.
One of the things that's curious to me, coming into academia, is that being a black professor is like being a white rhino. They're just very, very, all too few of us, virtually extinct. So the first thing you have to do, I think, is hire more black staff and promote the black staff that you have to greater positions of authority.
Thank you. That's very clear. Mark or Carol? Carol, have you stopped laughing enough to have a suggestion?
I'm panicking.
Take a moment if you want, if Mark's got a suggestion.
I can come through. Yeah, I think the key thing across all of this for me is the word value. I think we have to value what people like, Gary, Carol and Sonia and people like David Bailey and, can bring to the party in terms of knowledge. I think we have to value not necessarily our professors, but our senior lecturers, and we have to create pathways for them to be, for their work to be valued, for it to be seen. And I think that's on every level within the academy, within the institution. Value knowledge, we have to value the knowledge that can be created from different perspectives. We have to collect it, and importantly for me, we have to care for that.
Yeah. And I really want to mention the work of Shades of Noir in this, who are really pioneering how we improve our teaching inclusivity and recovering history. So obviously we still have a long way to go. Carol, last chance.
Okay, this is tough, but I suppose the recent experience is cross-generational conversations, I think, I don't know how that would take place, but I've just done a project with a PhD student at Edinburgh College of Art, Sequoia Barnes, African American, but we came together and she invited me and we did this performance at the Fruit Market Gallery. But that it's transformed my thinking, it's transformed her thinking. We're writing a paper together, and I said, you know, you lead and I will just follow, and it's just been an amazing experience. So again, the younger generation are coming at these issues from different perspectives, but us older generations have still got something to contribute. So I think that's one thing I can think of.
Thank you.
So,
thank you. So thanks everybody. I'm going to hand back to Brigitte Lardinois with my thanks to the Photography and the Archive Research Centre for convening this conversation. Then please keep your feedback, requests, thoughts about how we can develop this work, and much appreciation to three really significant cultural critics, commentators, writers, photographers, art historians. So Mark, Gary and Carol, really appreciate your individual work and to collectively how we're looking at a broader way of exploring and hopefully reforming a more decolonized culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pratap. And I would like to add your name to that list of illustrious speakers, because we are actually very, very lucky to have you as our Associate Dean of Research at LCC. And I feel really sorry, Gary, if you are now in Manchester and if you feel like a white rhino there, and we should all do everything we can to make sure that that's not the case in the next couple of years. So to all of you, to Carol, you were inspiring as always, and Mark, we've got you now. We'll keep talking, and I just want to thank everyone for attending, and we will post this session online. Sorry about the technical hitches. Nevertheless, a really, really wonderful hour and a bit. Thank you very much on behalf of LCC, and do please all join the graduate events that are online, and let's hope that maybe this time next year we can actually do this in a lecture theatre again. Thank you very much. On behalf of everyone, thank you.
Thanks, Brigitte.